2 centuries ago, this patch of earth was nothing but marshland. Mosquitoes swarmed over standing water. Oak trees towered where Pennsylvania Avenue now runs. Wild deer grazed where world leaders would one day meet. Today, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue is the most recognizable address on Earth. But here's what the polished tours won't tell you. This mansion wasn't built by the presidents who lived inside it. It was raised by hands that history tried to forget. Scottish stonemasons, Irish carpenters, and over 300 enslaved African Americans whose names were reduced to ledger entries marked with a single letter, N for Negro. This is the story of America's most famous house, and the uncomfortable truths buried in its foundation stones. The dinner that changed a nation, June 1790, New York City, a private dining room. The summer heat was suffocating. Inside a modest home on Maiden Lane, 3 men sat down to a meal that would reshape American geography. Alexander Hamilton was desperate. His financial plan, having the federal government assume state war debts from the Revolution, had become a political disaster. Southern representatives saw it as a Northern power grab, a way to enrich merchants and bankers while leaving agricultural states to foot the bill. Enter Thomas Jefferson, freshly returned from France and serving as Secretary of State. A political pragmatist when he needed to be, Jefferson saw an opportunity to broker peace. He invited Hamilton and James Madison, the influential Virginia congressman, to dinner. What emerged from that meal became known as the Compromise of 1790, one of the most consequential deals in American history. Hamilton would get his Assumption Plan, his financial system that would stabilize the young republic's shaky economy. In exchange, the permanent capital would be placed on the Potomac River, carved from land ceded by Maryland and Virginia, both slave states. Think about what this meant. Several established cities fought fiercely for this honor. Philadelphia offered functioning infrastructure and a cosmopolitan culture. New York had money and merchant power. Baltimore had a thriving port. But the Potomac site? It was tidal marshland, dense forest, clay soil that flooded with disturbing regularity. Imagine, for a moment, if today's leaders decided to build a new capital not in an existing city, but in humid, mosquito-infested bottomland hours from anywhere important. That's exactly what happened in 1790. Yet this seeming madness had method. Southern planters, including George Washington himself, owned significant property in the region. Land speculation would make them fortunes. More philosophically, a capital built from nothing could embody pure Republican virtue, untainted by the commercial corruption that clung to older cities like Philadelphia. It could become an American Rome, rising from wilderness to showcase democratic ideals to a skeptical world. On July 16, 1790, President Washington signed the Residence Act into law. A federal district of 10 miles square along the Potomac would become the permanent seat of government. Philadelphia would serve as temporary capital for a decade, while the new city took shape. Washington received extraordinary authority. He would choose the exact location and oversee construction of federal buildings himself. What followed would test every limit of American ambition. Urban planning in wilderness, architectural dreams meeting brutal reality, and a workforce that embodied all the contradictions of the young republic. The man who saw a city in the swamp. March 1791, the Potomac Riverbank. Washington needed someone whose vision matched his ambition. He found Pierre Charles L'Enfant, a French-born military engineer who had served with distinction during the Revolutionary War. L'Enfant arrived at the Potomac site in March 1791. Where others saw waterlogged, uneven landscape dotted with mosquito clouds, L'Enfant envisioned something extraordinary, sweeping boulevards and dramatic vistas that would rival the great capitals of Europe. His plan was audacious, a a city designed not for the fragile young republic that existed, but for the powerful empire he believed America might become. L'Enfant laid out a grid of streets overlaid with bold diagonal avenues radiating from key points, creating grand perspectives like those in Versailles or Baroque Rome. According to records from the Library of Congress, he identified two prominent hills in the landscape. Jenkins Hill would hold the Congress House, what we now call the Capitol. A rise roughly a mile and a half northwest would host the President's House. These structures would command clear views of one another across a broad public mall, symbolizing the connection between legislative and executive branches. But here's what's fascinating. L'Enfant envisioned a truly palatial president's house, roughly 5 times larger than what was ultimately built. A sprawling complex suited to state ceremonies, public receptions, and the everyday business of a growing nation. Set high on its hill, it would function as a Republican palace, visible from the Potomac River and from converging avenues. Broad prospects would stretch in several directions, allowing the chief magistrate to symbolically survey the city and country entrusted to his care. Yet L'Enfant's grand vision contained the seeds of his undoing. He refused to compromise on key elements. He clashed constantly with commissioners appointed to oversee development. He insisted on tearing down existing structures that interfered with his avenues, including the manor house belonging to Daniel Carroll, nephew of one of the most powerful commissioners. When L'Enfant ordered that demolition without proper authorization, he had gone too far. By February 1792, less than a year after presenting his design, L'Enfant was dismissed, but the heart of his vision survived. Commissioners kept the essential layout of diagonal avenues and the siting of major federal buildings while trimming back his more extravagant ideas. The President's House especially had to be reimagined as something more restrained, impressive enough to project dignity, but not so lavish as to suggest a royal palace. That tension between Republican simplicity and national grandeur would shape every major decision about the building's design. The competition that almost failed. March 1792, the commissioners chose to hold a public competition for the President's House design. Newspaper advertisements across the states invited architects and builders to submit plans for a residence housing the president, his family, and suitable servants. The prize, $500 or a medal of equal value, significant money at the time, roughly equivalent to $15,000 in today's currency. The competition drew a curious mix of entries, from strictly practical schemes to almost fantastical visions. Among them was one notable anonymous design later attributed to Thomas Jefferson himself. What these designs revealed is fascinating. Each plan was more than an architectural sketch. It was a political statement about executive power that a young republic, fresh from war against kings, was willing to accept. The commissioner's brief was deliberately vague, probably on purpose. The president's house should be commodious, large enough for official receptions and state business, but the exact size was left to each designer. It had to show dignity without drifting into showiness, grandeur without looking royal. This ambiguity opened the door to wildly different visions. Some entries leaned heavily on European palace traditions, long facades, multiple wings, rich ornament, and ceremonial halls that wouldn't have looked out of place in Versailles. These schemes found little favor with commissioners painfully aware that the new federal government already looked too monarchical to many Americans. Other submissions swung to the opposite extreme, offering buildings so modest they could have been townhouses of prosperous merchants. Practical, yes, but hardly settings to receive foreign ambassadors or host state dinners. One particularly intriguing design came from an anonymous entrance signing only with the initials AZ. The plan proposed a sprawling, villa-like structure clearly inspired by Italian Renaissance villas, a central rotunda with symmetrical wings stretching on either side. It was sophisticated, carefully proportioned, and obviously drawn by someone with real architectural training. Later research by the White House Historical Association showed this anonymous entry came from Thomas Jefferson himself. Despite serving as Secretary of State, Jefferson couldn't resist submitting his own idea. His design had one fatal problem in the commissioner's eyes. It felt too grand, too European, too close to aristocratic houses he had admired in France. Many other entries exposed the limits of architectural expertise in America at the time. The young republic had very few architects in the European sense. Most builders learned their trade through apprenticeship and hands-on work, not formal study of classical rules and proportions. Many submissions had a distinctly provincial character, structurally sound and practical, but missing the refinement that might give the building real presence on the world stage. What commissioners searched for was a design threading an almost impossibly narrow needle. The president's house had to be substantial enough to command respect from foreign powers, accustomed to dealing with kings and palaces, yet restrained enough to reassure American citizens that their president remained a fellow citizen, not a monarch in waiting. As summer slid into autumn 1792, commissioners went through submissions with growing frustration. None quite matched the vision in their heads. The deadline passed with no obvious winner. It looked as though the competition might end in disappointment. At exactly this point of uncertainty, a new design arrived from an unexpected direction, not from a celebrated architect in Philadelphia or New York, but from an Irish immigrant builder living and working in Charleston, South Carolina. His name was James Hoban, and his calm, balanced proposal would define what the home of the American president looks like for more than 2 centuries. The Irishman who built American Power County Kilkenny, Ireland. Circa 1755. James Hoban entered this world about as far from presidential grandeur as humanly possible. According to records from the Royal Dublin Society and historical research by the White House Historical Association, Hoban was born around 1755 in a thatched cottage on the Desart Court estate, belonging to the Earl of Desart, near the village of Callan in County Kilkenny. His father, Edward Hoban, worked as a tenant farmer or estate laborer. His mother's maiden name was Bain. The family lived in conditions of genuine poverty, the kind where survival itself was the primary accomplishment. This was tenant farmer territory in mid-18th century Ireland. Small cottages dotted narrow paths. For a young man with talent, but no powerful family connections, Ireland, under brutal penal laws, offered precious little chance to rise. Catholic families like the Hobans lived under legal restrictions that stripped away basic rights. They couldn't own property in most circumstances. They were barred from many professions. Public life remained largely closed to them. Yet Hoban possessed both ambition and skill that would not be contained by legal restrictions or social barriers. As a teenager, he apprenticed as a wheelwright and carpenter on the Desart estate, absorbing the hands-on work of masonry and carpentry. His abilities caught the attention of patrons, quite possibly the Earl of Desart himself, who provided education for talented children on his estate. With support, Hoban entered the Dublin Society's drawing school on Lower Grafton Street. This was no small achievement. The Dublin Society aimed to advance the arts in Ireland, and poor students who displayed great talent didn't have to pay fees to attend. There, promising students studied architectural drawing, perspective, and the classical orders that form the backbone of Georgian design. Hoban studied under Thomas Ivory, a prominent architect, and excelled so dramatically that in November 1780 he received the prestigious Duke of Leinster's Medal for his drawing titled Brackets, Stairs and Roofs. During these formative years in Dublin, Hoban encountered a building that would leave a permanent mark on his imagination. Leinster House. This grand townhouse of the Duke of Leinster, completed around 1750 to designs by Richard Castles, sometimes spelled Castle, showcased Georgian architecture at its most controlled and elegant. Solid stone construction with precise symmetry, calm proportions, and restrained classical detail projected aristocratic authority while maintaining a kind of cool republican seriousness. It avoided the heavy decoration of Baroque palaces while still commanding attention and respect. For Hoban, studying and likely working on buildings in this tradition, Leinster House represented perfect architectural balance, design that spoke of permanence and dignity without tipping into royal display. This building would become his template for America's executive mansion. The Atlantic crossing and Charleston's success. Mid-1780s, the Atlantic Ocean. After the American Revolution, waves of immigrants left Ireland for the new United States. Skilled craftsmen found particular demand in the growing nation. James Hoban crossed the Atlantic sometime around 1785, settling first in Philadelphia. He placed newspaper advertisements offering his services. Any gentleman who wishes to build in an elegant style may hear of a person properly calculated for that purpose who can execute the joining and carpenter's business in the modern taste. But Philadelphia was crowded with established builders. By April 1787, Hoban had moved south to Charleston, South Carolina. This seemingly odd choice would change American history. Charleston's thriving port economy was driving a building boom. The city needed capable architects and builders. Hoban partnered with Pierce Purcell, a fellow Irish carpenter, and began working on both public buildings and private houses. Their work included the 1,000-seat Charleston Theater and the Charleston County Courthouse, a structure that still stands today, with a portrait of Hoban hanging inside. By 1792, Hoban had built a solid reputation in Charleston. But he had also learned something that would shape his future: the brutal economics of slave labor. During his time in Charleston, Hoban purchased at least one enslaved person, a man named Peter. According to payroll records from the National Archives, Peter would later work as a carpenter on the president's house, though every cent of his wages went to Hoban, not to Peter himself. When word of the competition for the president's house reached Charleston in early 1792, Hoban recognized an opportunity that might never come again. He prepared his submission, drawing heavily on his memories of Leinster House, reshaping its Georgian balance and classical restraint for an American Republican setting. The winning design. July 1792. Georgetown. Hoban's proposal called for a 3-story structure, counting the raised basement, constructed in stone with a central entrance portico and evenly spaced rows of windows across the front. The plan was essentially a refined rectangle. Large staterooms on the principal floor, family quarters above, service spaces below. Practical, dignified, and clearly rooted in the Irish-Georgian tradition he had absorbed in Dublin. Crucially, Hoban understood something many competitors misjudged completely. Scale mattered more than spectacle. Where others had imagined residences roughly 5 times larger, and Jefferson had envisioned elaborate villas, Hoban offered a structure that could plausibly be built within realistic budgets and timelines while still giving the office of the president visible weight and authority. His design carried another subtle advantage: studied neutrality. It avoided dramatic stylistic gestures that could be read as political statements. The Georgian language, already familiar in America from colonial public buildings and houses, felt established rather than experimental, classical rather than fashionable, stable rather than showy. When commissioners met in July 1792 to evaluate the final entries, Hoban's plan stood out not because it broke new ground, but because it combined competence, clarity, and precisely the right level of ambition. President Washington, who participated in the final choice, reportedly appreciated both the practicality and dignity of the design. On July 16, 1792, exactly 2 years after the Residence Act was signed, James Hoban was declared winner of the competition. He received the promised prize of $500 and, far more importantly, the commission to oversee construction of the President's house. The little-known Irish immigrant had secured the chance to shape America's most symbolic residence, but the harder parts still lay ahead. The cornerstone and the truth in the foundations. October 13, 1792. The ceremonial laying of the cornerstone took place in a Masonic ritual led by the Lodge of Georgetown. The formal speeches, measured steps, and symbolic tools gave the moment an air of harmony and control. In reality, they were blessing the start of an extraordinarily difficult project in a location barely ready to hold a barn, let alone a presidential mansion. Before a single foundation stone could be laid, the land had to be conquered. The area was thickly wooded. Crews spent weeks cutting down trees, pulling stumps, and hacking away undergrowth. Then came grading and leveling, an exhausting process made worse by clay-heavy soil that turned into sticky mud whenever it rained. For much of that first year, more shovels than chisels were at work. The workforce that gathered on this muddy rise reflected the mixed, unequal world of early American labor. And here's where the official story starts to diverge sharply from historical reality. According to research by the White House Historical Association and documents held at the National Archives, the project leaned heavily on enslaved labor from the very beginning. Commissioners, always short of money and struggling to attract enough workers to this remote, unhealthy site, turned to the solution Virginia and Maryland elites used whenever they needed many hands. They hired enslaved men from nearby plantations. These workers were rented out by the year or season. Payments went not to the men doing the digging and lifting, but to the people who claimed to own them. Let me be very specific about what the historical record shows, because this matters. According to the White House Historical Association's Slavery in the President's Neighborhood initiative, over 300 enslaved African Americans helped build and staff the White House. The National Archives holds payroll records showing payments to slaveholders like Edmund Plowden, who hired out Gerald, Tony, and Jack. Sisters Elizabeth, Eleanor, Jane, Mary, and Teresa Brent hired out Charles, Davy, Gabriel, Henry, and Nance. Commissioner account books carefully recorded money paid to slaveholders, but often reduced actual workers to cold, repeated phrases like Negro hire, or marked them with a single N before their names. James Hoban himself brought 4 enslaved workers from Charleston to work on the President's house. Their names appear in a May 1795 payroll document: Peter, Ben, Daniel, and Harry. All were listed as owned by Hoban. Their wages were signed for by Hoban in the right column of the payroll sheet. Think about what this means. The architect of the President's house owned the men building it. They possessed real skill. They're listed as carpenters on the payroll. Yet every cent went to Hoban, not to them. Almost all heavy work fell on the shoulders of enslaved black men. Quarrying stone, hauling materials, digging foundations, mixing mortar, clearing land, the back-breaking labor that made the house possible. The Aqua Creek stone and the hands that shaped it. Spring 1793 through 1800. Construction. The main building material came from quarries in Stafford County, Virginia, roughly 40 miles south of the future capital. Aquia Creek sandstone was chosen because it was relatively soft, Masons could cut and shape it more easily than harder granite, and it could travel by water. Here's a crucial detail from the historical record. According to the White House Historical Association, stonemason Colin Williamson trained enslaved people on the spot at the government's quarry at Aquia, Virginia. Let that sink in. Enslaved people quarried and cut the rough stone that would become the walls of the president's house. They learned skilled stonework, then performed that skilled labor. But the federal government paid their enslavers, not them. The blocks were loaded onto barges and floated up the Potomac. At the building site, skilled stonemasons, many of them Irish and Scottish craftsmen like Colin Williamson, took over, trimming rough pieces into ashlar, the clean rectangular stones that give the president's house its calm, ordered appearance. But enslaved workers weren't just doing unskilled labor. Records show enslaved carpenters, bricklayers, and even stonemasons. Some brought genuine expertise to the site. Yet even when their skills matched those of free workers, they were typically rated at lower pay, with every cent still going to their enslavers. The workforce hierarchy was starkly visible on any given day. At the top stood European-trained master craftsmen, earning $1 to $2 daily plus room and board. Their names appear repeatedly in records: Colin Williamson, the Scottish stonemason, Philip Hart, and John Sheehan, Irish carpenters. Below them worked journeymen and apprentices, earning 50-75 cents daily. And then the enslaved workers, whose labor generated payment that went to plantation owners listed in ledgers. Charles Digges received payment for 5 Negro men for 1 year. Notley Young was paid for hire of slaves. The men themselves, often unnamed beyond a first name, attached to an enslaver's account. In late 1797, a particularly revealing incident occurred. White workers protested their wages and the pay given to skilled black workers. The commissioners responded by ordering that no Negro carpenters or apprentices be hired at either of the public buildings. Think about what this reveals. Enslaved workers had become so skilled that free white workers saw them as wage competition, even though the enslaved men themselves weren't receiving any wages at all. The Unfinished Mansion and its First Residence, November 1800. By autumn 1800, the president's house was frustratingly unfinished. But events left no choice. The 10-year deal allowing Philadelphia to serve as temporary capital had expired. President John Adams, nearing the end of his bitterly contested single term, moved into what was essentially a construction site. The exterior walls were up. The roof was in place. But inside, only 6 rooms had been plastered and made marginally livable. Staircases stood unfinished. The planned grand entrance on the north front had no portico. Visitors climbed temporary wooden steps instead. Adams arrived on November 1st, 1800. On his first night in the building, he wrote to his wife Abigail with a mix of hope and unease, adding a line that would be carved into American mythology. "I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house, and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." When Abigail Adams finally arrived in mid-November, her reaction was far less romantic. In letters to friends and relatives, she described constant cold, scarce firewood, and a house that was barely functional. Her most famous adjustment? The East Room, designed for grand receptions and state events, was useless with its bare walls and rough flooring. So she turned it into a giant laundry, hanging the family's clothes on makeshift lines. The image is hard to forget. The first family's undergarments and bed sheets swaying in the draft, where the young republic had imagined elegant assemblies. Fortunately for the Adams family, this uncomfortable chapter didn't last long. Adams lost the election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson. He would live in the unfinished president's house for only about 4 months. The job of turning the house from a barely habitable shell into something approaching its intended dignity would fall to Jefferson, who had once submitted his own anonymous design to the original competition. Jefferson's Paradox, 1801 to 1809. Thomas Jefferson took office in March 1801 with strong views about architecture, Republican symbolism, and how a president ought to live. His most important structural additions were the east and west terraces, low, colonnaded wings stretching from either side of the main block. They hid stables, storage rooms, and work areas behind elegant rows of columns, giving the house the classical touches Jefferson thought a Republican building needed. Inside, Jefferson oversaw the purchase and placement of furnishings, often choosing pieces in the French style he had admired as minister to France. He invested in spaces where he actually lived and worked. A well-stocked library, writing rooms, dining rooms suited to the intimate dinners that became his favorite way to conduct politics. He treated the land around the house with the same care. A passionate gardener and farmer, he oversaw the planting of trees and the layout of gardens, imagining the president's house grounds as something between a working farm and a gentleman's estate. Yet beneath this cultivated surface lay a reality Jefferson could never fully explain away. The work of finishing and refining the president's house still rested heavily on enslaved labor. Jefferson brought enslaved people from Monticello to serve in the mansion as cooks, servants, and laborers. According to the White House Historical Association, in November 1801, a 14-year-old enslaved cook named Ursula Granger Hughes arrived at the White House from Monticello to work in Jefferson's presidential household. She gave birth to a child, likely named Asnet Hughes, in March 1802. This was the first child born at the White House, born into slavery. Unfortunately, the child was in fragile health and died by late summer. Hughes returned to Monticello. The contradiction was staggering. The author of the phrase, "all men are created equal," running a presidential home staffed in part by men and women who could be bought and sold. Jefferson was not blind to this tension. In his letters, he could condemn slavery as a moral wrong and a threat to the Republic. In his daily life, he continued to depend on it. That contradiction took physical form in the president's house. Here was a structure meant to embody equality before the law, maintained by a hierarchy so unequal that some of the people who worked there did not legally own their own bodies. The invasion, August 24, 1814. All of this refinement, all of Jefferson's careful shaping of the president's house, was about to be tested in the harshest possible way, not by a political rival or a tight budget, but by invading troops and open flame. The War of 1812 had dragged on for more than 2 years with no clear winner. In summer 1814, British strategy suddenly shifted. With Napoleon defeated in Europe and veteran troops now available, Britain decided to strike directly at the American capital. British forces under Major General Robert Ross and Rear Admiral George Cockburn landed in Maryland and began their march toward Washington. The American defense, thrown together in haste and poorly coordinated, collapsed at the Battle of Bladensburg on August 24th. President James Madison actually rode out to watch the fighting, making him the only sitting president to personally witness combat while in office. He saw American militia units break and run before disciplined British regulars. With the defenders scattered, the road to Washington lay wide open. Madison hurried back to the president's house and found a capital in full retreat. Inside the mansion, his wife Dolly was directing one of the most famous rescue efforts in presidential history. According to contemporary accounts, including a letter Dolly wrote to her sister, though the original letter no longer exists, and what survives is a transcript, She stayed at the White House as British troops approached, determined to save key documents and artifacts. Most famously, she insisted on saving Gilbert Stuart's full-length portrait of George Washington, hanging in the state dining room. Here's where the historical record gets interesting. In her letter, Dolly described the difficulty of saving the painting. Since it was screwed to the wall, she ordered the frame to be broken and the canvas pulled out. But Paul Jennings, President Madison's personal servant, who was enslaved by Madison and present at the White House that day, later wrote in his memoirs that the rescue stories crediting Dolly were exaggerated. It has often been stated in print that when Mrs. Madison escaped from the White House, she cut out from the frame the large portrait of Washington. This is totally false. She had no time for doing it. It would have required a ladder to get it down. All she carried off was the silver in her reticule. John Siausat, a Frenchman, then doorkeeper, and McGraw, the president's gardener, took it down and sent it off on a wagon. The truth appears to be somewhere between these accounts. Dolly ordered the rescue. Siausat and McGraw carried it out, working together to save this symbol of the first presidency. As the Madisons crossed the Potomac heading west, British troops marched almost unopposed into Washington on the evening of August 24th. The burning August, 24-25, 1814. Night. British officers led by Admiral Cockburn entered the mansion and found it empty, but with dinner still laid out in the state dining room. Whether the meal had been prepared for the Madisons' possible return, or simply left during the rush to evacuate, remains uncertain. The officers sat down and ate it. Seated at the American president's own table, they reportedly toasted the success of British arms while finishing his abandoned dinner. It was part practicality, part theater, a small, sharp gesture that mocked the idea of American sovereignty even before the flames were lit. Then they set about destroying the building. The goal was not random looting, but the deliberate crippling of government infrastructure. British soldiers dragged furniture into piles, added books, papers, curtains, and anything else that would burn, and set fires throughout the mansion. For 14 years, the house had been filling with perfect fuel: wooden furniture, wall paneling, doors, and carpets. The Aquia Creek sandstone walls could withstand fire, but nearly everything inside them was wood. Once the flames caught, the interior burned fiercely. Heat built until glass shattered, beams snapped, and whole sections of flooring crashed down into the basement. That night, a violent summer thunderstorm rolled over the city. Sheets of rain poured through the burning roof. Some accounts suggest this downpour may have kept the mansion from being completely destroyed, dousing fires before they could reduce the entire structure to rubble. By dawn on August 25th, the president's house was a ruin. From the outside, the building still stood, its stone walls blackened and cracked from the heat. Inside it was a shell, staircases collapsed, floors fallen through, the roof mostly gone. The British stayed in Washington for roughly 24 hours, then withdrew. They left behind a capital city physically wrecked and a young nation deeply shaken. Yet even in the ashes, the story did not end. Rebuild or retreat? August-September 1814. The capital in ruins. In the days after the British attack, with smoke still drifting from the president's house and the capital standing in similar ruin, a hard question landed in Congress. Should Washington even survive as the capital? Some representatives argued that the fire had exposed the original mistake of placing the nation's seat of government in a remote, poorly defended swamp. They pushed to move the capital back to an established city like Philadelphia or New York, or perhaps farther west, to follow the expanding frontier. Others warned that abandoning Washington now would hand Britain a victory far greater than anything it had won on the battlefield. If the United States walked away from its burned capital, they argued, it would look like the young republic had lost its nerve, that British matches and British torches had accomplished what British muskets could not. That argument carried the day. The decision was made to stay and to rebuild. Once that was settled, another question followed almost automatically. Who should lead the restoration of the president's house? The answer was both practical and symbolic. James Hoban, the original architect, would be called back to bring his creation back from the brink. By this point, Hoban was in his late 50s, well established in Washington, with numerous architectural and building interests. According to the White House Historical Association, Hoban had become one of Washington's most prominent citizens, serving on the city council and helping to develop Catholic institutions, including Georgetown University. Seeing his greatest work reduced to a gutted shell must have been painful, but he accepted the commission with a mix of professional pride and personal determination. He would not just repair the house, he would prove that the building and the nation could come back from disaster. The Phoenix Rises, 1815-1817, Reconstruction. The first task was understanding exactly what remained. During the winter of 1814-1815, Hoban and his team surveyed the ruins in careful detail. The exterior sandstone walls, though smoke-stained and weakened in spots, were still sound, proof that the original masonry had been done well. The east and west terraces added under Jefferson had survived with damage that could be fixed. Inside, however, almost everything was gone. The floors, staircases, roof timbers, interior partitions, window frames, doors, all the wood that made the stone shell into a home had burned. What lay ahead was not simple repair work. It was full interior reconstruction, almost as demanding as building the place from scratch. Congress appropriated funds for the job, at first not enough, then supplemented as costs became clearer. Construction began in earnest in spring 1815. The workforce looked very familiar. Irish and Scottish stonemasons returned to handle the masonry. American carpenters took on the new framing and finish work. And once again, enslaved laborers hired from nearby Maryland and Virginia plantations provided much of the heavy lifting and rough work. According to historians, there were fewer enslaved workers involved in the reconstruction than in the initial construction of 1792-1800, but they were still essential to the project. The same brutal economics that had built the house would now rebuild it. Some of the craftsmen who had worked on the original building came back, now 20 years older, but carrying invaluable memory of how the house had first been put together. In an era before copies of blueprints were easily made and stored, that lived knowledge often filled in the gaps where drawings and specifications had been lost or damaged. The decision that changed a name. 1816 to 1817. One of the most important choices of the reconstruction concerned the exterior stone. The fire had left the Aquia Creek sandstone discolored and more porous. Smoke stains marked the walls. The intense heat had pitted and roughened the surface. Some stones had cracked and had to be replaced, but tearing down and rebuilding the entire exterior was neither necessary nor affordable. Hoban proposed a different solution: coat the whole exterior in white paint. This was not just cosmetic. A thick layer of lead-based white paint would seal the stone, slow weathering, and give the walls a consistent, clean surface that hid the worst fire scars. At the same time, it changed how the house looked from a distance. Instead of pale, mottled sandstone, the building now appeared as a bright, uniform block of white. That decision quietly locked in the mansion's future identity. Even before the burning, some people had occasionally referred to the building as the White House, likely because of the naturally light color of the stone. But after Hoban's reconstruction, with the exterior deliberately painted brilliant white, the nickname became unavoidable. The bright white facade stood out starkly against the still thin cityscape of Washington and could be seen from far across the open fields. The title White House would not become the official name until President Theodore Roosevelt made it formal in 1901, but from 1817 onward, the visual cue was impossible to miss. Monroe moves in autumn 1817. Driven by wounded national pride and desire to show resilience to the world, the reconstruction moved at a pace that would have surprised those who remembered the slow rise of the original walls. By autumn 1817, the President's house was ready once again to be lived in. President James Monroe and his family moved in that November, almost exactly 17 years after John Adams had first taken up residence. Monroe walked into a house that in many ways was better than the one Adams had found. The interiors were more refined. The circulation made more sense. The white exterior pulled the composition together with a clarity it had never quite had before. The building now told a very particular story. The Republic might be attacked, even burned, but it would not vanish. It would rebuild, and it would do so in a way the whole world could see. The President's house had survived its trial by fire. The reckoning that took centuries, 2000s present. Truth emerging. For generations, the story of the White House focused on presidents, architects, and grand political moments. The people who actually built it, who quarried its stones, mixed its mortar, raised its walls, remained largely invisible. That began to change in the early 2000s. In 2005, Congress put together a task force to shed light on enslaved labor in the construction of government buildings. After months of research, the commission announced that, while it would never be able to tell the full story of the enslaved laborers who built these buildings, there was no doubt they were intricately involved in the work. The White House Historical Association launched its Slavery in the President's Neighborhood initiative, carefully researching payroll records, census documents, and scattered historical sources to reconstruct what had been deliberately obscured. What they found was sobering. Over 300 enslaved African Americans helped build and staff the White House. These workers came from all over the region, from as far north as Cecil County, Maryland, to southern areas such as Stratford, Virginia. Historians created interactive maps showing where slaveholders rented out their enslaved workers. Payroll records revealed that slave owners were paid for each enslaved person, who was marked by an N before their names for Negro. The research identified names where possible, from James Hoban's personal workers, Peter, Ben, Daniel, and Harry, enslaved carpenters whose skills built the President's house but whose wages went to Hoban. From plantation owners, Gerald, Tony, and Jack, hired out by Edmund Plowden and Joseph Queen. Charles, Davy, Gabriel, Henry, and Nace, hired out by the Brent sisters. And hundreds more whose names appeared only as first names, or who were reduced to ledger entries. 5 Negro men hired for 1 year. The first child born at the White House? Born into slavery. Ursula Granger Hughes's infant, who lived only months before dying in 1802. The servant who witnessed Dolly Madison's famous rescue of the Washington portrait. Paul Jennings, enslaved by President Madison, who would later write one of the most valuable first-hand accounts of life in the early White House. The speech that acknowledged history. July 25, 2016, Democratic National Convention. When First Lady Michelle Obama took the stage during the first night of the Democratic National Convention, she delivered a line that reverberated across the nation. "I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves." It was a powerful moment, hearkening back to the generations of African Americans forced into bondage in this country, acknowledging a truth that official tours and polished histories had glossed over for too long. According to news reports from the time, the White House Historical Association was flooded with calls after her speech. Americans wanted to know, who were these enslaved African Americans who built the White House? This led historians from the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture and the White House Historical Association on a years-long journey that turned up some answers and even bigger questions. As historian Jesse J. Holland told Smithsonian Magazine, there is no telling how many stories that have been lost because, as a country, we didn't value these stories. We are always learning more about the presidents as we go forward, and we'll also learn more about the people who cooked their meals and dressed them, the ongoing work, present day. The research continues. Historians painstakingly comb through fragmentary records, trying to pull individual lives out of the shadows where they were deliberately placed. The White House Historical Association maintains an extensive timeline of enslaved and free African Americans in and around the White House, with a list of all their known names. But the gaps remain vast. Most slaveholders did not teach enslaved people how to read or write, and over time, states passed laws making these acts illegal. Few written sources from enslaved people themselves survive. Additionally, all of James Hoban's personal papers were destroyed in a fire sometime during the 1880s. What remains to document his life are those written in a professional capacity, which reveal little about Hoban's views on slavery. The physical structure tells part of the story. The sandstone from Aquia Creek quarries, shaped by hands that would never vote or own property. The terraces Jefferson added, built by people he claimed to own. The rebuilt interiors after 1814, raised again by a mixed workforce of free craftsmen and enslaved laborers. Every stone, every beam, every inch of plasterwork bears silent witness to the foundational contradiction of American democracy. A nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, built in part by people who were legally defined as property. What the White House means: reflection. 2 centuries after Irish immigrant James Hoban put pencil to paper in Charleston, the White House stands as more than just a building. It remains a living contradiction wrapped in white paint and American mythology. Every president who has walked its halls has inherited not just the office, but the weight of those unnamed hands that carved its stones and mixed its mortar. The official tours show gleaming rooms and polished floors. They tell you about presidents and first ladies, about state dinners and historic decisions. And these stories matter. They're part of our national narrative. But they cannot erase the truth embedded in the very foundations. This house rose from the labor of enslaved men whose names appear in ledgers only as line items, if they appear at all. It was built by immigrants seeking opportunity and craftsmen whose skills outlasted their recognition. The British burned it down, but America rebuilt it stronger. Technological advances transformed it from a drafty mansion into a modern nerve center. Yet through every renovation and restoration, the fundamental paradox remained: a symbol of democracy built on the denial of freedom, a beacon of equality constructed through inequality. Consider what this means for how we understand American history. We can acknowledge that George Washington helped found a nation based on revolutionary principles of human liberty, and simultaneously owned more than 300 enslaved people. We can recognize that Thomas Jefferson wrote some of the most soaring language about human equality ever penned, while depending on slave labor at Monticello and bringing enslaved servants to the White House. We can honor James Hoban's architectural achievement in designing an enduring symbol of the presidency, while confronting the fact that he owned the skilled workers who built his masterpiece. These contradictions don't cancel out the achievements. They complicate them. They make them human. They make them real. And they demand that we ask difficult questions. How do we honor the vision of democracy without ignoring the people excluded from it? How do we celebrate architectural brilliance without erasing the hands that made it possible? How do we tell the complete story of American power, both its inspiring ideals and its brutal compromises? The lesson: the White House teaches conclusion. Today, millions of visitors stand before those white walls and see what they choose to see. Some witness the triumph of democratic ideals. Others recognize a monument to contradictions we still struggle to resolve. Perhaps both views are correct. Perhaps the White House serves its greatest purpose not by hiding these tensions, but by forcing us to confront them. The building endures because America endures, imperfect, complicated, constantly rebuilding itself on foundations both inspiring and troubling. Over the years, the White House has witnessed Lincoln's sleepless nights during the Civil War, fighting to end the institution of slavery that had helped build the very house where he slept. The suffragettes demanding the right to vote, chaining themselves to the White House fence because women, like the enslaved workers before them, had been excluded from the democracy the building symbolized. The civil rights movement, as activists fought to make real the promises of equality that had been written but not yet fully realized, and countless other moments where Americans pushed the nation to live up to its stated ideals. The White House has been renovated, expanded, modernized, and preserved. But one thing has remained constant. It stands as a reminder that American democracy is not a finished product delivered whole and perfect in 1776 or 1792. It is an ongoing project, a promise made that each generation must work to fulfill. That may be the most honest lesson the White House can teach, that progress comes not from perfection, but from the willingness to face uncomfortable truths and keep building. To acknowledge that the hands that raised this house included those of enslaved African Americans, Irish immigrants, Scottish stonemasons, and countless others who deserve to be remembered, not as anonymous labor, but as individuals whose skill, sweat, and sacrifice made American democracy possible. The White House stands, white and gleaming, on Pennsylvania Avenue. But its story is written in shades of gray, in the moral complexities of the people who built it, lived in it, and worked to make the ideals it represents more than just words on parchment. This is the White House, America's most famous house, and perhaps its most honest mirror. Visiting today. If you visit the White House today, take a moment to look beyond the polished surfaces. Touch the sandstone walls and remember the quarries 40 miles south, where enslaved workers cut the stone. Stand in the East Room and picture Abigail Adams hanging laundry where diplomats now gather. Walk through the spaces Jefferson designed and think about Ursula Granger Hughes, the 14-year-old enslaved cook who gave birth to the first child born in this house. Look at the restored interiors from Hoban's 1817 reconstruction, and consider the mixed workforce, free and enslaved, who rebuilt what the British had burned. The White House is all of these stories, the triumphs and the tragedies, the ideals and the failures, the democracy we proclaim and the injustices we're still working to overcome. It's the most American of buildings, aspirational, contradictory, evolving, and ultimately honest about who we are if we're willing to look carefully enough. That honesty, more than anything, is what makes 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue worth studying, worth preserving, and worth confronting with clear eyes and open minds.